Welcome to Flow Unleashed. I'm Cameron Norsworthy, and this is your podcast for human performance.
Cam, in your book, you write that your psyche, when untrained, will naturally get in your way. When did you first discover your own psyche was getting in your way? And was there a moment you realized you needed your own flow mindset, your own change of perspective?
I mean, there are countless moments and experiences of when, even today, even just 15 minutes ago, my psyche gets in my own way. When you say that, the memory and the image that comes to mind is I was doing a public talk. I was probably 17 years old, and talking was always difficult for me. And as growing up, and I'd get very self-conscious. I'd go into a stutter and a stammer, and my brain would go ahead, and I just couldn't keep up with it, and it'd end up just pushing words out of my mouth. And I'd got to a place with it where it didn't necessarily bother me too much because I was quite used to it. But I was in a situation where I was talking about my experience, and which in theory should be, there's nothing I need to make up there or impress people with. But yet my brain was just thinking too much. As often you do in a performance setting, we become more present and time seems like it slows down a little bit more, and there's just a bit more time within each breath and within each moment, and we become more aware and take in more information. And I could just see very clearly that my brain was on, I wanted to go over here and just talk about something easily, but my brain was going this way, and it was down all these rabbit holes, and it just wouldn't allow me to do what I wanted it to do. And I know that I could do it because I had that conversation previously, not in a public setting. And it really dawned on me then that we have these, what I've come to term as our evolutionary errors, right? In the sense that we have our human operating system, if you like, our hardware that we've inherited from all our ancestors before us. And whilst we've continuously been optimizing and we've become more evolved human beings as time has gone on, we still have components of how our brain works, how our system and body psyche works, that don't help us in certain situations. And the three big ones for me are when we go into a threat response, right? We normally enter like a fight, flight, freeze, fawn or flop response because the biology triggers our thinking brain or explicit cognition to step in to deal with the situation. And we have this normal threat response that when we get uncomfortable, when we sense a threat to our comfort, our competence, even if it was basic as running out of coffee in the morning, or the butter isn't in the fridge, or the painting is askewed or whatever. And straight away there's like this alarm bell in the brain that goes, something's wrong. And it's like, and that physiological response is really helpful, makes us alert and present. But when we hold on to it just for a split second longer than it's helpful, we suddenly become tight and rigid, and conflict occurs. And then that thinking part of our brain goes, I need to step in here to sort it out. And in that stepping in, we think. And in that thinking, we interject in a way that isn't helpful to the task at hand. And so we become wooden, stiff, and we make mistakes, or we fluster, or whatever it is. So that sort of overreach of our thinking brain, using parts of our brain for moments in which it's not best designed to take that captain's chair, that's one evolutionary error, if you like. And then another evolutionary error is that through Bayesian inferencing and predictive processing, we're constantly predicting to the future to make ourselves feel more comfortable in the moment. Or what's going to happen next? Or what's Kev going to ask next? And how am I going to be able to answer it? And how am I going to feel okay and more in control and more comfortable? The brain will naturally do this about everything, whether it's talking to someone at the coffee counter to order a coffee, or it's a world championship match that's about to occur. And in that prediction, we make projections. And in that projections, we build an experience around it. And we unintentionally train our brain and body to operate and have that experience when the time comes. And so that process doesn't always help us out, and is very much an evolutionary error for most of the time, because we're not dealing with the life-threatening situations that we're used to stepping out of the cave. And then thirdly, we tend to treat ourselves much worse than we would any other entity, even some animals. When we make a mistake, we're always like, why did I do that? I'm such an idiot. And sometimes it's even worse. And if you were to take that exact language and map it over to a relationship, it might be deemed unacceptable or abusive or whatever. But we're normally quite happy to treat ourselves like that. And so not being able to speak in public and constantly, there were times I could get through in social situations, but I became very adept at having replete one-liners and avoiding situations where I had the center of attention on me for any length of time. And it quickly dawned on me that all these things were happening and I didn't have much control over them. And I got to a place of comfortableness with it, that I could look at it with curiosity without feeling like it was me or identifying with it. I could see my brain go down a self-conscious hamster wheel and go, that's really weird, my brain's doing this. Why is it doing this? As opposed to immediately attaching myself to it and feeling that that's who I am. And so I guess that's quite a young age, around late teens, to become aware of this type of stuff. For different people, it's at different stages of their life where they might have that awareness. But that's certainly when I started to realize that my psyche, if I don't optimize it, if I don't train it, then it isn't going to help me out all the time.
Cam, I want to be mindful that someone that may have picked up your book in the future, or someone that's listening in by accident, might not understand some of the terminology that you've used so far. So maybe let's break them down one by one a little bit. The thinking brain, suggesting that there's different brains. What is what, and what would you explain the terminology means here?
So from a neuroscientific cognitive perspective, the brain's obviously very intricately linked, but in order to understand it, the common agreed concept is that we have two brains within our brain, which they call dual cognition, two operating systems to think with. And when we look at how we learn, how we remember, how we process emotion, how we perform, there seems to be this distinct usage of these two different operating systems during different tasks. One is more implicit. I call it the being brain. Different sciences will call it the implicit system, the hot system, and there's several names for it depending on the subspecialism that scientists are into. But there's this more innate one that's hardwired to our motor cortex, to our movement, hardwired to more our cerebrum and basal ganglia, that allows us to sort of operate automatically. It's that part of ourself that would be most associated with a lion pouncing, or I can bring this cup to my mouth and drink without even thinking about it. It allows all those decisions and processes to occur almost seamlessly. And then there's the thinking part of our brain, which is engaged when we become very thoughtful, reflexive, conscious, critical, analytical. And it's typically associated with the front part of our brain, that kind of medial lateral prefrontal cortex. And that's why when we get stressed or we overthink, we tend to sort of rub our foreheads. And you can feel your energy if you're really thinking about something. There's a sort of a tension at the front of your head. And they're both amazing tools. And they're always working in parallel. But often over the centuries, we've promoted the thinking brain through education, through society, through how we think we should deal with issues. And for the most part, that's correct. You know, it allows us to coexist without killing each other, build stuff. Otherwise, we might still be wearing fur pelts and fighting each other for that animal on the savannah. But there's times where we want to trust our intuition. There's times where, like in flow, where we can just allow our training and our system just to do without this conscious thinking interference. And so understanding that we've got these two operating systems and we might live more in one than the other, or understanding what they're best suited for, allows us to have a better relationship between those two brains, because often those two brains are sort of fighting for dominance as to which one's going to captain our experience in any given moment.
And then you said Bayesian inferencing?
Yeah, so Bayesian inferencing can be swapped out with predictive processing. So in order for the brain to process the moment, the brain goes through this process of predicting what might happen to then cross-reference it with the past of our experience, and then bringing in present moment variables, and then making a decision whether our foot should go to the left or to the right, whether I should say this word or that word, whether I should feel excited or nervous. And all of this is happening in, you know, micro moments within any given second. But there's this constant prediction to what might happen to feel more in control, to feel safer, to feel more capable and meet our innate goals of doing well and surviving and so forth. So it's a very natural process, but often it doesn't work for us. Like I would ask any person listening to this, just to go ahead and think of a confronting conversation you've got to have with a partner, a friend, or colleague. Just take a moment now to project and think about that confronting conversation. Now, ordinarily, I would ask people, what's been your experience? And ordinarily, they would say, I'm talking and it's a bit tense and it's a bit clunky. And immediately, we've trained the brain to feel nervous and clunky and awkward when the time comes, because we've created that prediction. And the brain doesn't distinguish between what's real or imagined. So in projecting to the future, in this predictive processing scenario that's very innate in all of us, we've set ourselves up for failure, really. And another way of looking at that situation is having a confronting conversation with our loved one or a friend is a great thing. It shows that we care, it shows that we're willing to actually put energy into the relationship to go through the difficult times. And isn't that a rich experience? Coming back to the earlier conversation, and what if we just imagine that confronting conversation as something that flowed and that was something that was complex but meaningful? Suddenly that changes our whole experience of what that visualization looks like. So whilst that predictive processing is innate within every brain, how we use that, if untrained, is not to our advantage for a lot of the time when projecting to a challenge.
Well, thinking of your career as a tennis player, tennis requires constant pressure and management and a lot of mental resilience. Tell me, how did your experience there shape your understanding of what an untrained mind does to you and how to navigate in it?
Oh, every match brings up an interesting. In some of my keynotes, I go through the story of how I was playing at the Irish National Championships. I'm not Irish, by the way, but I was invited to play, and I was playing the number 2 seed, and I was playing the game of my life. I wasn't expected to win. I didn't even know who these people were. I just kind of rocked up, and it was all just going fantastic. And I was 6-love up in the tiebreak, and then suddenly I was like, I only need one more point, and then I've won the set against the number 2 seed. What is everyone going to think? And then slowly but surely my experience and performance started to unravel. And the more I became, oh my God, I've lost a point, I'd tighten up and the serve would just go long, and oh, it's 2 points. Oh my God, I've only got to win one more point. Sure, just don't mess up, and suddenly in protection mode, and I'm deep in the red. And there's this, with tennis, you can be in one moment, you can be playing out of your skin, and then a split second later, you can be a million miles away from it. As with any kind of scenario where the outcome is really important. And as soon as that psyche hinges to that outcome, suddenly the whole approach to the challenge, the whole experience changes. And for myself, almost with every point, I mean, I play tennis now. Thankfully, science has been able to allow my body to play tennis again. And almost before every point, there's that little monkey in my brain that's like, oh, you got to win this next point. But now I can laugh at it, and I can kind of go, you cheeky monkey. No, I'm gonna apply my flow mindset here. So growing up playing tennis, I was filled with this randomness, right? I was filled with this up and down and roller coaster ride of hitting a great shot and then following it up with 3 bad points, and that the experience was such a roller coaster ride that I'd just end up with this relief that the point, the match, the set, the game was over. And the only thing that really was my tonic was this self-induced trance state that I would do to myself. And it became something that just felt very innate, very natural. I didn't plan it. I wasn't taught it. It just eventuated from me not wanting to have this experience, knowing I wanted this flowy experience, and just over time knowing what kind of got me into that absorption and what got me into that place of trust. And before every point, I would just stare at something, activate my peripheral vision, heighten my senses to the moment, and almost get to a place where I'm kind of almost how you are with, like, when you're cross-eyed, you're just a bit zoned out and tranced. But to get to that place which would effectively shut off my thinking brain, and then as the ball came hurtling towards me, I would just play, and then I would just trust myself playing, and realizing that was a preparation tool to help me have a better experience and play better tennis. That really allowed me to realize how much psychological interference and psychological conflict can ensue when I'm not managing my mind. And just with a simple tool like that, how different the experience can be when I take a moment to manage myself.
I don't know why, but when you told that story, I was imagining almost that scene from Matrix where he starts to find out the agents, and it just happens so effortlessly. So I was just envisioning you with the with the racket just going full Matrix on the opponent.
It can feel like that sometimes when you're in the chaos and the head spin, and you don't know what's going on, and the whole world can be around you, and it's just raining chaos, and your limbs can do funny things. And this is way before you even get to choking, and it ends up being tight and forced as opposed to fluent. And yeah, it's funny. But then when suddenly all that's taken away, it's like this easy bliss that you're like, why isn't it like that all the time?
Would be good, hey? Yeah. Why is it not like that? Your book is structured as Ready, Steady, Flow, and not how to find flow. And that's a deliberate choice. How and why is that?
It didn't set out as a deliberate choice, but it's ended up a very deliberate choice, because in trying to communicate these tools to better set ourselves up for success rather than set ourselves up for stress, it became very obvious that we needed these three modes, if you like, to focus on. And the modes I'm talking about here is this idea of there's an initial self-leadership, like a foundational element of how we approach the task. And that's really the bedrock, the foundations. And if that's not in place, no matter what momentary trick or tip or tool we use later on, it's not going to sustain itself. And our ability to be in flow is going to come crashing down if that foundation isn't there. So that deeper psychological rewiring of why am I here? What am I doing it for? What's my focus here? That a bit more of a philosophical, intentional phase that very much encompasses our self-leadership. How am I leading myself in this situation? That was very important to get across. And some people had those skills, but then couldn't just nudge themselves into flow, and vice versa. Other people had later skills that I'll talk about, but didn't have that foundation. And so over time, I could see that there was this sort of initial phase where we needed to get ready. We needed to make sure our self-leadership was heading in the right direction, and we had put on our flow mindset. And then the second phase, it became evident that when we were ready and when we had made those changes to our thinking, and even if we had a resolute belief that these changes were going to work and it was a good thing, our consciousness can still get distracted, can still get hijacked by a friend walking past, by someone saying something that triggers something inside of us, a song that we hear. Could be anything. But our consciousness is always vulnerable to being distracted and conflicted. And even if we've got that good wiring underneath, we can't just rest on those laurels. We need to actually put flow and the flow mindset as an integrative, intentional part to how we prepare. So am I integrating flow into those the night before, the morning of, the 3 hours before, the 3 minutes before, the 3 seconds before, and so forth, as opposed to it just being an initial choice that we've made philosophically, but then we actually get ready in the time before the act and our consciousness goes all over the place. So there were important practical tools that I felt for people who were looking to find flow within given moments, that they needed a few tools to optimize their preparations so they could set themselves up for success rather than setting themselves up for stress. And then flow, that last piece, is really about self-actualization. So we had self-leadership, self-regulation, that steady part. Can I self-regulate myself to stay ready? And then this last bit, can I allow myself to self-actualize? Can I actually not just be intentional but with it, but can I move to an experience, an embodied experience of intuitive action? Can I go from being focused to being absorbed? Can I go from a high degree of effort, full control, to a high degree of effort, less control? And how can I actually just surrender and let it happen rather than make it happen? And those more nuanced skills that differentiates flow from being playful or a clutch state where we might be performing well, but it's a gritted, forced experience. And those sort of more nuanced skills are really playing with the edges of how we experience moments and the level of trust we have with ourselves in those moments. And again, that required a sort of a different set of skills than the previous two. And whilst they're all kind of interlinked and can certainly be stacked, it felt very helpful because a lot of people would have skills in one area but not the other. And it would also ensure that when we are preparing ourselves in the right way, if we can ready and put our self-leadership towards flow, and then stack that with our preparations and self-regulate ourselves in the moment towards flow, then we've got a really good platform to hopefully find flow. And then lastly, if we can apply a few skills to allow ourselves to self-actualize and remove the self-shackles and limiting factors that ordinarily restrain our experience to the ordinary, then that's a pretty rock solid routine to set ourselves up to allow flow to occur. And so that ready, steady flow seemed like a really nice sequential ritual to help us, to help put the platform for flow to occur.
Cam, what did you observe in your coaching that made you realize that this self-leadership had to come first in the process for people to be able to self-actualize?
It was these foundations crumbling that was most noticeable, right? I feel like people can get into flow in any given moment for different reasons, right? In the sense that you can be running away from the police and have not prepared at all, but you're suddenly cornered and you climb a fence that you look back the next day and you're like, how on earth did I climb that? And you scaled it, and there was enough motivation there that your body responded. However, when we're wanting to find flow frequently and have it as an integral part of our lives and find it consistently, re-engineering that forced motivation is nearly impossible. And so whilst there were lots of people, myself included and others, if I just take tennis, for example, they've got the talent to be in flow. They do find flow. They hit these incredible shots, but over the length of a match, they would be up and down like a yo-yo. And the foundations underpinning all of that would fall away. And for me, what was most stark in my understanding of this was when I couldn't play tennis and I had traveled a lot and gone backpacking around the world and still realizing that I'm quite well suited to athletic pursuits, that I could most likely find my flow within sporting endeavors, and not able to do a lot of the sports I wanted to with the injuries to my arms. I stumbled across the world of adventure sport and action sports and loved it. And getting immersed in that arena, in that context, it was really eye-opening for me, because the people that I met, they were there for the stoke. Even in competitions, everyone celebrated each other. There was just this desire and joy to be where we were. We were at the top of a mountain or a secluded beach or a little island or these sort of action sports cathedrals in some kind of random place on this planet that no one would ever go to unless you're into this sport. And everyone was just stoked to be there, right? And there was this collaborative approach to what everyone was doing. There was this approach to the challenge, this approach to the competition that was really, really intrinsic. There was a real, there wasn't the usual comparisons of I'm better and you're worse. And everyone felt equal because we were all there for the reason to surf this incredible wave, to ride this fresh powder. And then when someone did do something incredible, everyone celebrated it. And there was this whole different approach to this, to taking on a challenge that didn't involve the anxiety and the dread and the kind of combative competition that a lot of the traditional sports that I was used to, where you walk into these performing arenas and they're filled with it. And it was really eye-opening that you can have a completely different approach to a performance. And what was also really interesting was that these people were amazing, and they were far outperforming what people would expect of them, and they were doing it very different from how a tennis player or a footballer or a hockey person or a rugby or a swimmer was taught how they should compete from the more traditional sports psychology messages that occurred at the time. So that was a real eye-opener, that actually we all need perhaps a bit of help with that self-leadership and how we orientate ourselves towards a challenge.
Well, so as this book suggests, there's 2 more steps to it, right? So when did you realize that just having the right mindset and moving into also keeping steady was necessary? Why does consciousness management really matter that much in this context?
I think it matters because we're human, right? In an ideal world, we'd set that readiness, we'd be ready, we'd set that approach, and we wouldn't need anything else. We would just meet the challenge or complexity, and it would happen. But because we're human and we're complex and we have an ego and we have years of conditioning and we get triggered and the brain wants to think and wants to complicate things, our consciousness gets hijacked and we move away from that approach and we start to create thoughts and feelings and projections that don't best serve us to operate how we want to when the time comes, making us slightly slow, slightly hesitant, slightly doubtful, slightly tense, slightly rigid when we go to perform. So it really came as like a second part to my practical and coaching journey. You know, I was more of an ideologist and thinking, oh, we've just got to think it and believe it and it will happen.
Manifestation.
Yeah. You know, and to a certain extent that's true, and we're still very much human. And unless we're putting ourselves in this isolated bubble, removed from all distraction, then we will engineer conflict internally. And so this step is really about how we can stay present or curate the experience that we want to in the time leading up to it, so we can peak for a particular sporting event. We can stay calm and open for a particular conversation, whatever the event coming up is.
Yeah, and I'd even argue that even if you could isolate yourself completely, then the mind would conjure up a new scenario where the loneliness or the lack of connection to other people would just cause a different set of problems for you.
Yeah, absolutely. We only need to look at people that live on an island for too long, including myself at one stage in my life, or people put in solitary confinement. And yeah, the brain can start to not work for us again.
So how does the ready, steady flow concept avoid the no pain, no gain trap? How do we manage that?
First of all, both research and my personal experience would suggest that mantra usage is effective, right? The more we can anchor ourselves to a particular pre-crafted phrase that we feel is going to align ourselves with what we want, the more likely we are to embody that. And so having a mantra reminds us, right? It keeps things, all right, I'm back here. This is who I want to be. This is how I want to feel. And if I was to sort of sum it up very simply, this approach allows us to choose flow over friction. And it reminds us in the moment, am I creating friction to this situation that I'm going to have to put a whole load of energy in to overcome this friction? And then because of all that energy that I've expended, it's impossible for me to be my absolute best. And the fact that there's friction there, it's conflict. And so I've got a fractured psyche. And again, being an optimal, coherent state is impossible. So choosing flow along that journey continuously removes that friction and gives us the best chance to have that harmony, that integration at different levels.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm wondering, while writing this book, which one was the hardest part of this book to write? Because we talked about different layers, right? Talked about that there were different phases in either going too academic and too theoretic or too practical or implementing your own personal story to it. What about the book was the most challenging to you from a personal psychological perspective?
In the initial stages, it was this. I'm writing about a topic that is, I guess some people would see as like the holy grail of performance, or a rich, optimal human state of functioning. So it's kind of like, oh, who am I to be talking about this, or who am I to be suggesting that this is the way that it's possible to create this more in our lives? So there was this initial sort of hesitation of, am I really sure? I kind of know this works, but maybe it's all just luck, or maybe what's. And so there was, I guess, that own self-belief that over time just became super self-evident with all the client feedback and my own personal experience, and that this approach is really, really helpful. And so, and I guess this is not just like when I started the writing book, this was the journey beforehand. And I felt like I needed to have a PhD on the subject in order to talk about it with some kind of credibility. I felt like I needed to have lived and breathed it and helped hundreds and hundreds of clients to be able to subsume that this feedback that I'm getting wasn't an N of one, wasn't just random samples, that is just another subjective experience that confuses the mind. So that was an initial one, and then I think more towards the latter of the book, when the publisher asked me, we need to have more of your story in it, Cameron. We need to understand your journey behind it, because that's what will help people through the book. Because talking about human experience is a fairly heavy subject, and I was quite sort of easy talking about the science of flow and the practice of flow and client examples of flow, but then talking about my own life and some of these stories, they're not very public. I'm generally quite an introverted person at home, and because of the past struggles I've had with just speaking and feeling comfortable in social settings, I'm not one to sort of own the room and grab that attention. And so putting all those stories out felt a bit self-serving, or a bit, do people really want to hear this? And so getting through that, which was probably a layer of self-worth there, and a layer of sort of self-esteem that I needed to feel, that I needed to own, that I needed to step into and go, actually, no, this is quite interesting. And often it's that personal experience that people can relate to.
Well, I can already tell you now that at least I'm grateful to be able to be part of extracting and listening to the story, because it's valuable to connect to that side of it, to join it. And so thank you for that. You mentioned that you felt you needed a PhD to write on the subject, that now you are an expert. So did you find that writing this book revealed any gaps in your own practice and knowledge around it?
Yeah, I think there were huge learnings in writing the book and the content that went into it. And there were huge learnings doing the PhD and reading all the incredible research that had gone before. Before that time, there was very much in intuitive sense of knowing where to go with it. And whilst that's fantastic and really helpful for a personal scenario, in order to communicate that and allow other people to share in some of that wisdom, bringing in all that great research from hundreds of other researchers was really, really important to help me see a wider variety of how flow had been utilized, how flow had been conceptualized, how flow had been thought of, how flow had been integrated. And so there was lots of gaps that I hadn't thought about, and allowed me to see things from a different perspective, which then either strengthened or changed, my own perspective on things. So certainly that was hugely important. And then in terms of actually writing the book per se, I had to change my belief in my own writing. Being dyslexic when I was younger, not really wanting to write, and as I stated earlier, writing wasn't something that I'd pride myself on. So there was an undercurrent there of, I'm not very good at this, or I don't believe I can really write very well. And throughout the process of the book, I needed to learn to alleviate that and learn to trust myself instead, and not get caught up in the outcome, and really put on my flow mindset in order to write the book. And not get caught up in what other people would think of it, and not get caught up in what's right or wrong or good or bad or the outcome, or not constantly compare and critique and have that self-doubt, but really put on that flow mindset of, what's my intention here? What's the meaning I'm trying to communicate here? And that would help me really focus on the next paragraph, and then have belief that the words would come.
Yeah, that's a good example of how to apply what we talked about so far in your own personal experience. Did any of your own experiences contradict what you were writing? Were the moments you thought, wait, I need to reconsider this?
I mean, what stands out to me is really the core conceptualization of flow. Part of my work academically has been to cohere a lot of the research around flow, often disparate and comparable research, because we use different language, or we conceptualize flow differently, and rightly or wrongly often bastardized towards the end goal of a particular paper or project. And the more I would write about flow, I mean, when I did my PhD on flow, I think the first draft I did was 600 pages long. and it was really a synthesis of other people's, yeah, it was very, very long, and it was a synthesis of other people's work. And one of my roles was how do I actually cohere all of this and write it in a way that how can I synthesize all these different disciplines? How can I synthesize all these different terminologies and come out with a parsimonious description that everyone can understand, that reflects everyone's work and represents this core experience of flow? And about writing about all the nuances of a deep connection, and so many of the great experiences we get when we're deeply, time transformation, when we're deeply in flow. It also dawned on me that in mild states of flow, we might not have that affinity with all these deep layers to the experience. And actually there's the continuum there. We might enter flow and then experience mild flow, and the deeper we get, the more absorbed we become, and the more complex or more absorbing and differentiated from normal waking consciousness our experience becomes. And so in writing and trying to find all the ways that would best work, simplifying flow to this absorption, but it's not just absorption, because we can be watching a movie and be absorbed and in trance, but not be in flow, and this effortless high degree of control, that feels more effortless than usual. When those two things come together and creating this intrinsically rewarding feeling that we just want it to happen again and again and again, that changed my thinking about it, because previously I just loved all those nuances and going down the rabbit holes of all these kind of crazy experiences that we can have within flow and exploring all of that. But actually in trying to communicate all of that, it was like, how do I communicate these like 30 nuanced descriptions? And in writing it and rewriting it, it really stood out that actually there is this core experience that seems to be across, the majority of all this data. And so that was really, really interesting, because it wasn't what I expected at all. I felt like initially when I started off, I was probably going to complicate things more rather than simplify things.
Well, simplify you did for sure. Were you writing this during a particular season of your life?
A season would probably be Parenthood, if there was a season.
It's a long season.
I think whenever people start to have kids, there's this innate, it might be more of a male thing, but I've got to create, or I've got to build, or I've got to do something of substance so they can be proud of me. And often I think people don't know it's happening, but we get into this sort of frenzy of building and doing. And certainly the book was one for me.
Yeah, I can relate to that one. Well, Parenthood, how did that inform how you wrote this? Would it have been different if you would not have kids?
Oh, very good question. I don't know is the answer to that, because I don't know what life would have been out. I'm sure something would have come out, but whether it would have come out so practical, I'm not sure. Definitely I was keen to try and leave at that time what I thought was my most important message that I could pass down to my kids.
I'm wondering if becoming a parent changed the way your flow mindset operates. Is there something that changes in that scenario of having to step into that new role?
I think it's helped me see flow as a lifestyle pursuit. Previously, I'd probably been more into those deeper flow experiences and recreating it and having this more peak experience around it. And I get more absorbed into the moment. And there's another conversation to have at another time, maybe when we talk about flow a bit more deeply, about how absorbed do you actually become, and is too much absorption a good or a bad thing? But and save that for a later time. But certainly with parenting, you're constantly distracted and there's a million tasks and you've got to switch from one task to the next. And seeing the whole task of parenthood as an opportunity of flow was really interesting for me, because instead of it was like, can I find flow whilst playing with my kid here? Or can I be in flow whilst playing football? It was sort of actually the parent, can I be in flow in parenting? Can I swap between playing football and doing the washing up and talking to them without friction, in this sense of effortlessness, but still be totally present to each task? And that came interesting. So the milder states of flow became perhaps more interesting to me in terms of what I wanted in my day-to-day life. Could I meet those days with less stress, with less friction, with more harmony, with more flow, as opposed to, can I create this super intense experience that I'm going to remember for ages.
So, do you have a prompt or a question for someone listening in, being a parent, that might be valuable for them in relation to flow?
What I found really, really interesting is that some of the best parenting advice that I've ever received or given to other people is to actually work on themselves. Because as you know, the individual, the parent, work on themselves and removing conflict and work on their own personal development. Because with parenting, there's so much distraction and conflict that comes up every single day. You know, whether it's, I used to get woken up by my son bouncing on my head, right? And when you wake up with someone bouncing on your head, you're suddenly like, ugh! and am I going to suddenly go into the stressful individual who behaves in a way that I don't want to behave and feel shamed about afterwards? Or can I smile and laugh in the few seconds of just coming from a deep sleep towards something hitting my head? And like that's just one sort of micro moment, but the parenting is filled with all of this stuff, from having my own plan and children not caring about time or my plan. And can I turn that into an opportunity where we can flow together and there's less friction, and suddenly I become immersed in what we're doing, and there's a mild state of flow there. And so I find if we can prioritize our own flow, remove our own conflict, then actually that does wonders for meeting the moment with the child in the context of that parenting. Often I think we forget as parents that we're leaders as well as caretakers, especially in those earlier years. And actually kids imprint what they see us doing, not what we're saying or how we're trying to manage their behavior. They take on how we treat ourselves. They take on how we treat our partners. And that's what they imprint. That's how they learn to operate in the world and have relationships with themselves and with other people. And so if we can be working on our own flow in our own relationships and how we treat ourselves, then that just makes parenting so much easier. And rather than trying to be the perfect parent or manage behavior in a particular way. It also, I think it's also really helpful because in that journey to finding flow, we need to understand subjective experience, and we need to understand to varying levels what the brain is and what it does. And when we understand those two things, we can really get to understand our kids, not from what we want them to be, but really where they are on that biological generative development and psychological development.
Yeah, I always jokingly say that parenthood, if you embrace it, is the best leadership training. If you're faced with having a little gremlin that's being splashed with water from the second you open your eyes, testing and probing you with this paradoxical emotion that you're loving them to death, but you need to show up in the first second while they're making your life a living challenge in a way, right?
Yeah, really nice point.
Do you ever feel the weight of saying, here's how to find flow, when you know it's a lifelong practice? How do you hold that responsibility?
I mean, it's interesting. I don't hold that responsibility for flow or for other people. I kind of see it very much as a journey, and we can find flow this afternoon if the situation presents itself and there's an optimal level of challenge and a high degree of motivation and so forth. But to be in flow as opposed to randomly hit moments of flow is, as you said, it's a lifelong practice, and one that we never master, but one that we make shifts with orientating ourselves and our lives towards allowing it more frequently. And I think they support each other. The more we go along that lifelong practice, the more we're able to find flow in the here and now. And the more we focus on the here and now, the more we make subtle decisions, lifestyle decisions, and engage in that lifelong practice and become flow fit as we would adopt a get fit practice.
What would you want readers to know about the limitations of flow thinking? Are there situations where flow is not the answer?
I guess it depends how you interpret that question. Certainly we can't be in flow all the time, and we need restoration. We need moments of giggling and love that aren't effortless control. We need moments that give the yin to the yang. You know, flow is often about a deep level of engagement and commitment, and we need time to stare into space and just process and have different experiences in the moment. But I guess when we see all of that as part and parcel and creating harmony inside of us, then it all kind of comes back to flow. So certainly we don't need to be in flow in every second of the day. But if flow is our priority, we also need to prioritize those other moments, those other states that allow us to get that seesaw back to a balance point. So harmony can then naturally feed off it.
Yeah.
A great one is going to bed early. I used to always think, oh, I'm missing out, or, you know, I want to watch this. There was always it was a negative. You know, I guess you could use the analogy of there's always more flow to be had in the day. But then when I started to see of going to bed early as an investment in my tomorrow and my flow tomorrow, and I can't be in flow tomorrow if my batteries aren't charged. And then suddenly I was like, oh yeah, give me that pillow. I want to see what it feels like against my cheek. You know, so I guess a good analogy of that.
Cam, thanks for doing this.
My pleasure. That concludes our first section of our inside look into the book, How to Find Flow. Stay tuned as we take a deeper dive into each main section of the book, starting with Ready. Thank you for listening to Flow Unleashed. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to get notified when our next episode drops. The more people that subscribe, the better I can make the show for you. Equally, please leave a review. Your review will go a long way to helping others find this pod. Until the next time, thank you for listening to Flow Unleashed.